Hello everyone! Today's joke of the day is why didn't the skeleton cross the road? Stay tuned to find out. Our learning target for today is I can solve a complex equation with absolute value. So we've learned how to solve equations with absolute value before. It means that we always have two cases, right? So we just split it up. But in this first example, we have 2 times the absolute value of x minus 3 equals 8. And we can't split up our absolute value equation until we isolate the absolute value. So just like when we're solving an equation by isolating the variable, in this case we're going to isolate the absolute value and then solve using the absolute value rules that we learned before. Okay, so in this case we want to first, let me grab the pen. We want to first divide by 2 on both sides because here we're taking 2 times the absolute value. So we want to divide by 2 on both sides. And those 2's then will cancel out. So we end up with the absolute value of x minus 3 is equal to 4. Okay, and now we can split this into our two cases. So we'll have case 1 is x minus 3 equals 4. So it's exactly as we see it, right? But we just dropped the absolute value signs. And the second case is that we have x minus 3 equals the opposite of 4, so negative 4. Okay, so let's solve both of these equations then. Here we have x minus 3 equals 4, so we want to add 3 to both sides to isolate the variable. That gives us x is equal to 7. Okay, and then in this second one, we want to also add 3 to both sides to isolate the x, and we get x is equal to negative 4 plus 3, which is negative 1. So in this case, our answer is that x is equal to 7 and negative 1. That's kind of a bad bracket, but there we go. Okay, and we can always check our answer by substituting our x's back into our original equation. So I can substitute 7 in right here for x. So if I take the absolute value of 7 minus 3, well, that's 4. The absolute value of 4 is just 4. Then I have 2 times 4 equals 8. So I know that that's good. I can do the same thing with negative 1. Okay, so if I take negative 1 minus 3, that gives me negative 4. And then the absolute value of negative 4, well, that's 4. And then I take 2 times 4, which also gives me 8. So I know that these are my answers, and I checked them, okay? All right, let's look at this next example. Here we have negative 3 times the absolute value of x minus 4 is equal to negative 12. Okay, so I'm going to isolate the absolute value, just like I would isolate a variable to solve an equation, by dividing by negative 3 on both sides, right? Because the inverse operation of multiplication is division. So then those cancel out, and I'm left with the absolute value of x minus 4 equals negative 12 divided by negative 3 equals a positive 4. So there we go. Okay, and now I can split it into my two cases. So case 1 is that we have x minus 4 is equal to 4, just as we see it. And then case 2 will be that x minus 4 is equal to the opposite of 4, so negative 4, okay? And now I can just solve both of these equations. So I want to add 4 to both sides, because that's the inverse operation of subtraction. So then I have x equals 8 for this one. And then over here, when I add 4 to both sides, that gives me x equals 0. So in total, I get x is equal to 8 and 0. Okay, those are my two answers. And I could check those, but for time's sake, I'm going to move on to the next example. Okay, in this one, it looks like we have to do a couple operations to isolate our absolute value. Here we have 5 times the absolute value of x plus 2 minus 8. So if we just had 5x minus 8 equals 7, if this was our case, then what we would want to do is we would want to add 8 to both sides. So we're going to do the same thing here. So we'll add 8 to both sides first. Okay, and that will give us, so those 8's cancel out. Negative 8 plus 8 gives us 0. We're left with 5 times the absolute value of x plus 2 is equal to 15. Okay, now the second operation I would do is to divide by 5 on both sides. Okay, and then those 5's cancel out, and I end up with the absolute value of x plus 2 is equal to 3. Oh, forgot my absolute value bar there. And now I can split it up into my two cases. So my first case is that x plus 2 is equal to 3, okay, just as I see it. And then my second case is that we have x plus 2 is equal to negative 3, okay, the opposite. All right, so in this case, we can go ahead and solve, and now we want to subtract 2 on both sides to end up with x equals 3 minus 2, which is 1. And if we subtract 2 on both sides over here, we get x equals negative 3 minus 2, which gives us negative 5. So my answers here are x equals 1 and negative 5. Okay, those are my 2 answers for this equation. And I can box them there. Okay, and this one we want to kind of do the same thing. So we have negative 2 times the absolute value of x plus 8 minus 5 equals negative 7. Okay, so if this was just negative 2x minus 5 equals negative 7, the first thing we would want to do is add 5 on both sides. So that's what we're going to do here. Okay, because then those 5s cancel out. So then I get negative 2 times x plus 8, or times the absolute value of x plus 8, equals negative 7 plus 5 gives us negative 2. Okay, and then we can divide by negative 2 on both sides, which will cancel out these negative 2's, and gives us the absolute value of x plus 8 is equal to negative 2 divided by negative 2, which is 1. Okay, and now we can split it up into our 2 cases because we've isolated the absolute value. So case 1 is just as we see it, x plus 8 equals 1. And case 2 is x plus 8 equals negative 1. Okay, same thing, but with a negative 1 instead. And now we can solve by subtracting 8 on both sides. So we get x is equal to 1 minus 8 gives us negative 7. And we subtract 8 on both sides of this one, gives us x equals negative 1 minus negative 8, which is minus 8, which is negative 9. So the answers, the solutions to this equation are x equals negative 7 and negative 9. Okay. All right, let's check out another one. If this was 3 times x plus 9 equals 27, our first step would be to subtract 9 on both sides. So that's what I'm going to do here first. Subtract 9 on both sides, then those 9's cancel out, and we're left with 3 times the absolute value of 2x minus 6 equals 27 minus 9, which is 18. Okay, and then we can divide by 3, because that's the inverse operation of multiplication, to get the absolute value of 2x minus 6 is equal to 6. Okay, and now we have isolated our variable, so, or not our variable, our absolute value, so we can take and split it into our 2 cases. Case 1 is 2x minus 6 equals 6, and case 2 is 2x minus 6 equals negative 6. Okay, so now we want to solve by adding 6 on both sides first to get that 2x is equal to 12, and then divide by 2 on both sides to get x is equal to 6. And then finally over here, we will add 6 on both sides to get that 2x is equal to negative 6 plus 6 is 0. And we can still divide by 2, right? Because we can divide 0 by any number. And then x equals, well, 0 divided by 2 is just 0. So our 2 solutions for this equation are, maybe I'll write them in a different color so you can see, x equals 6 and 0. Okay, let's maybe check these ones to make sure that we know we're doing it right. So for case 1, we have 3 times the absolute value of 2 times 6 minus 6 plus 9, and we want to see if that equals 27. Oops, I wrote 29. I meant 27. 27. Okay, we'll fix that 9. Okay, well, if I look at this, 3 times the absolute, so let's look at the absolute value first, right, because that's a grouping operation. So we have 2 times 6 is 12, minus 6 is 6. Okay, so this is all 6 here. And then 3 times 6 is 18. 18 plus 9 is 27, so we checked it off. That one works. Okay, we could also look at number 2. We'd have 3 times the absolute value of 2 times 0 minus 6 plus 9 and see if that equals 27. It's 27. Okay, and 2 times 0 is 0, minus 6, that's negative 6, but the absolute value of that is 6. So we have 3 times 6 plus 9 Well, that's 18 plus 9, and that does equal 27. So we're all checked off. We know that that works. We are going to skip this last example and move on to the summary. Okay, so if we think back in the video to what we just watched, right? What were our steps? Well, our first step is to isolate the absolute value, right? Just like we would a variable, using inverse operations. Just like we would with any variable, we use the inverse operations to isolate it. Okay, that's our first step. And then the second step is once the absolute value is isolated, we can split the equation into two different parts, and then we want to solve each equation. Okay. Now for the joke of the day, why didn't the skeleton cross the road? Well, because he didn't have the guts. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.